Welcome to Ghost Vibes. Today, we are not simply recounting a tragedy. We are diving into the heart of a vast conspiracy that stretches from the Gilded Age of finance to the icy depths of the Atlantic. The sinking of the RMS Titanic on April 15, 1912, was a human catastrophe that claimed over 1,500 lives. But for a century, this disaster has been shrouded in claims of corporate greed, deliberate sacrifice, and a dark curse. This is the extended, meticulous breakdown of the Titanic's demise. The story begins not in the Atlantic, but in the massive shipyards of Belfast, Ireland, where the Titanic was born. Conceived by J.P. Morgan's International Mercantile Marine Corps IMM and built by Harland and Wolff, the Titanic was not merely a vessel, it was a symbol of industrial, financial, and technological supremacy. Along with its sister ships, Olympic and Britannic, it was designed to be the largest movable object ever created by man. She was boasted as being practically unsinkable, a phrase that would soon haunt the entire Western world. The design included 16 supposedly watertight compartments, leading to a dangerous hubris among its owners and crew. This overconfidence directly influenced the lack of sufficient lifeboats, a critical and fatal miscalculation. Regulations of the time were criminally outdated, basing lifeboat requirements on the ship's tonnage rather than the number of passengers. The Titanic carried lifeboats for only 1,178 people, despite having over 2,200 souls on board. This was the first undeniable act of corporate negligence. The true darkness, however, begins with the passenger manifest, which contained a highly unusual concentration of the world's most powerful and outspoken financial adversaries of J.P. Morgan and the Federal Reserve. Three specific men stand out: John Jacob Astor IV, the richest man on the ship, a real estate and business magnate who was vehemently against the formation of the Federal Reserve; Isidor Straus, the co-owner of Macy's department store and a fierce opponent of central banking legislation; and Benjamin Guggenheim, a prominent mining magnate who was also skeptical of Morgan's financial ambitions. All three men perished. Their disappearance removed the three strongest financial opponents to the Federal Reserve Act, which was later passed in 1913, just a year after the sinking. The claim that Morgan, the supposed architect of the Titanic, ordered the ship's destruction to eliminate his financial rivals, remains one of the most persistent and disturbing conspiracy theories surrounding the disaster. The theory gains traction from one startling fact. J.P. Morgan himself was scheduled to be on the maiden voyage, but canceled his trip at the last minute, citing illness, though he was seen healthy and well in France shortly thereafter. Beyond the financial motives, a more ancient, almost supernatural narrative exists: the curse of the mummy. Legend suggests that the Titanic was secretly transporting an artifact, the supposedly cursed mummy of an Egyptian priestess named Amun-Ra, which had been acquired by a collector. The artifact, it is claimed, was responsible for a string of minor misfortunes on the Olympic-class liners. The story, popularized after the sinking, suggests that this heavily cursed item was being transported in the hold, and its removal from its proper resting place provoked a spiritual wrath that sealed the ship's fate. While dismissed by historians, the persistence of this tale highlights the public's need to find a cosmic, rather than purely human, explanation for the unimaginable loss. Adding further complexity to the narrative is the Olympic switch conspiracy. This highly detailed theory suggests that the ship that sank was not the brand new Titanic, but its damaged, decade-old sister ship, the Olympic. The Olympic had suffered a severe collision in 1911 and was deemed too costly to repair fully. The theory posits that the White Star Line, facing massive financial ruin from the Olympic's damage, secretly switched the two ships, fraudulently insured the old Olympic as the new Titanic, and intended to deliberately sink it to collect the massive insurance payout. Evidence cited includes minor discrepancies in the porthole count and hull markings visible in early photographs. If this theory holds true, the sinking was not a tragic accident, but a premeditated act of mass murder driven by desperation and corporate deceit, a deliberate sacrifice planned to look like an unavoidable tragedy. The financial and structural desperation of the International Mercantile Marine Corps provides a terrifying motive for such a crime. As the Titanic steamed out of Southampton, loaded with both millionaires and immigrants, she carried not just passengers and cargo, but the weight of industrial hubris, financial conspiracy, and an almost supernatural sense of impending doom. The atmosphere on board, documented in the diaries of surviving passengers, was one of overwhelming celebration, blind faith in technology, and stark class division. This division, which dictated who had access to lifeboats, would become tragically relevant in a few short days. The stage was set for the collision that would change the world, a collision that many believe was planned all along. The immense pressure to break speed records and the captain's desire to please his financial backers, who prioritized timing over safety, set the ship on a trajectory toward the fatal encounter with the dense ice field. The maiden voyage began with an air of theatrical splendor, yet quickly encountered the chilling specter of reality. The White Star Line had appointed Captain Edward J. Smith, a highly respected veteran of the sea, who was slated to retire after this very crossing. His presence was intended to instill confidence, yet his final fatal decision to maintain an aggressive speed through a well-known ice zone remains one of the greatest maritime errors in history. This decision was driven not only by professional pride, but by immense pressure from his superiors and White Star Line Managing Director J. Bruce Ismay, who was aboard the ship and whose presence created an unhealthy environment prioritizing speed and glamour over caution. The critical factor that night was the constant stream of ice warnings. For days leading up to the disaster, the Titanic received multiple telegraphic messages from other ships in the North Atlantic, detailing exceptionally large and dangerous ice fields situated directly in the ship's projected path. At least 7 major ice warnings were transmitted, including specific reports from the Caronia, the Baltic, and the America. Shockingly, many of these warnings were treated with casual indifference by the Titanic's radio operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride. The radio room was overwhelmed with the mundane task of sending and receiving voluminous personal messages for the wealthy first-class passengers, a service considered more critical than relaying navigational hazards. One particularly detailed and urgent warning from the nearby steamer, the Californian, was abruptly cut off by a frustrated Jack Phillips, who famously snapped at the approaching ship's operator, shut up, I am busy, I am working Cape Race." This action sealed the fate of the Titanic. The Californian's captain, Stanley Lord, after being rebuffed, chose to stop his ship in the ice field for the night, fearing the danger. He was mere miles away from the Titanic, his lights clearly visible from the doomed liner's deck, yet their communication had been tragically severed. The atmosphere on the Titanic that Sunday night, April 14th, was deceptively calm. Down below, the first-class passengers dined on luxurious 10-course meals, oblivious to the fact that they were racing towards disaster at nearly full speed, approximately 22 knots. Above them, in the crow's nest, lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee were battling not only the chilling cold, but also a lack of proper equipment. A minor logistical failure, the key to their binoculars, had been misplaced in Southampton. As a result, the lookouts were forced to rely solely on the naked eye to spot danger in the moonless, exceptionally calm night. The sea was so flat, an unusual phenomenon that night, that it prevented waves from breaking against the icebergs, robbing the lookouts of the dark line of water that often signals ice ahead. The silence of the night was lethal. At 11:39 p.m., Fleet's desperate voice rang through the telephone to the bridge. "Iceberg right ahead." First Officer William Murdoch, who was in charge, immediately ordered the engines reversed and the helm turned hard to port. However, due to the ship's immense size and speed, the maneuver was too little. Too late. The Titanic began a slow, agonizing turn, but the submerged portion of the iceberg, the notorious foot, raked along the starboard side of the hull. This was not a head-on collision, but a glancing blow that ripped open 5 of the supposedly watertight compartments over a length of approximately 300 feet. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer who was also on board, was immediately summoned to assess the damage. Andrews, the man who knew the Titanic's anatomy better than anyone, descended to the lower decks. The devastating news was quickly delivered. The ship could withstand the flooding of 4 forward compartments. With 5 compartments breached, the fate of the unsinkable ship was sealed. The water would inexorably flood the bulkheads one by one, pulling the boat down into the deep Atlantic. At 12:05 a.m., Captain Smith gave the devastating order, "Send the call for distress." The world's greatest ship had less than 2 hours to live. The silent certainty of the sinking, known only to a few men on the bridge, contrasted terrifyingly with the joyous ignorance of the thousands of souls below. The immense power and speed that had defined her passage now became the final determinants of her destruction. The reality of the disaster descended upon the Titanic's occupants with agonizing slowness. After receiving Thomas Andrews's dire prognosis, Captain Smith issued the order to uncover the lifeboats. Yet even with this definitive command, a pervasive sense of disbelief and denial paralyzed many passengers and crew. In the luxurious first-class lounges, passengers continued their conversations, certain that the damage was minor and that the unsinkable ship was merely experiencing a temporary delay. This fatal complacency meant that many of the first lifeboats launched were tragically underfilled, some leaving with less than half their capacity. Boat number 7, the first to be lowered, carried only 28 people despite having space for 65. This shocking waste of life-saving capacity would become one of the most agonizing footnotes of the disaster. The class divisions, which had marked the voyage's luxury, now dictated survival. The first-class deck was closer to the lifeboats, and its passengers were prioritized. The thousands of third-class passengers, or steerage, were housed in the ship's bowels and were intentionally delayed from accessing the upper decks. Locked gates and confusing pathways meant many immigrants struggled to find their way through the labyrinthine lower decks, a systemic failure that ensured a far higher mortality rate among the poorest passengers. The heroism of several crew members who fought to unlock these barriers and direct the immigrants upward, despite orders to the contrary, is a rarely celebrated footnote of courage. As the bow dipped deeper, the chaos grew. The first-class orchestra, led by Wallace Hartley, continued to play rousing ragtime tunes and hymns, a final profound act of calming an increasingly hysterical crowd. Their music provided a tragic counterpoint to the mounting terror and the chilling hiss of the steam being vented from the funnels. In the radio room, operators Jack Phillips and Harold Bride worked frantically, sending the internationally recognized distress call, CQD, and later the newer SOS. They were exhausted, their radio equipment barely functional, yet their persistence was the only hope for the thousands on board. They finally made contact with the RMS Carpathia, a Cunard liner under the command of Captain Arthur Rostron, located nearly 58 miles away. Rostron immediately ordered his ship to race toward the Titanic's coordinates, demanding maximum speed from his crew, knowing he was battling both distance and time. The final hour was defined by the laws of physics and the terrifying shift in the ship's structure. As the water poured into the forward compartments, the weight caused the stern to lift higher out of the water. The colossal forces exerted on the ship's keel became too immense. Around 2:18 a.m., the ship's back snapped between the third and fourth funnels, the area where structural integrity was weakest due to the length of the hull. This structural failure marked the definitive end. The forward section plunged rapidly, and the stern section briefly righted itself, rising vertically into the sky, a terrifying silhouette against the stars, before it, too, plummeted into the 12,500-foot-deep abyss. The screams of the 1,500 people left stranded in the freezing near-zero-degree water were so loud and so sustained that they permanently scarred the memories of the few hundred survivors huddled in the lifeboats. In the midst of this pandemonium, another ship's presence was repeatedly noted. The lights of the mysterious ship, believed by many to be the Californian, remained visible on the horizon throughout the entire sinking, a silent, dark witness. This ship, which never responded to the Titanic's rockets or distress calls, compounded the tragedy. Captain Lord of the Californian later claimed he saw the rockets but believed they were merely signals from a passing tramp steamer or company fireworks. His failure to respond or even wake his radio operator cemented the Californian's role as one of the most controversial elements of the disaster, a ship that could have saved hundreds of lives, but chose instead to stand still, shrouded in its own silence. The tragic failure of the Carpathia's rescue was compounded by the unforgivable inaction of the closer vessel. At 4:10 a.m., the Carpathia arrived at the coordinates, navigating the treacherous ice field at full speed. Captain Rostron and his crew found not a sinking ship, but a sea littered with floating debris and the small scattered lifeboats. They spent the next 4 hours pulling 705 freezing, shell-shocked survivors from the water, a stark and agonizing number against the more than 2,500 who had been lost. The sheer vastness of the loss of life, contrasting with the number of empty seats on the lifeboats, left an indelible mark on the survivors and the world. The investigation into why so many were left behind and why one nearby ship remained silently idle was about to begin. Following the rescue by the Carpathia and the return of the survivors to New York, the public demand for answers was immediate and ferocious. Two major governmental inquiries were launched almost simultaneously. One in Washington, D.C. by the U.S. Senate, led by Senator William Alden Smith, and another in London by the British Board of Trade. Both investigations, driven by political pressure and public outrage, quickly focused on two primary failures: the lack of lifeboats and the unforgivable inaction of the nearby steamship, the Californian. The American inquiry, which was quick, aggressive, and often sensationalized, immediately called White Star Line Managing Director J. Bruce Ismay to testify. Ismay, who had controversially saved himself on a lifeboat while hundreds of women and children perished, became the face of the White Star Line's corporate negligence. The inquiry revealed the criminal inadequacy of lifeboat regulations and the immense pressure placed on Captain Smith to maintain high speed. Ismay's testimony was scrutinized to the point of public scorn, but the inquiry ultimately stopped short of confirming any deliberate act of malice, concluding the event was an unfortunate, though tragic, act of vis major, act of God. The deepest cut of the investigation centered on Captain Stanley Lord of the SS Californian. Lord, whose ship was stopped just miles from the Titanic, claimed he saw mysterious lights and rockets but dismissed them as signals from a small local vessel. When questioned, his crew testified that they attempted to signal the large liner with a Morse lamp, receiving no reply. Crucially, the Californian's radio operator had gone to bed just minutes before the Titanic struck the iceberg, and the ship's bridge crew failed to wake him despite observing the distress rockets. Both the American and British inquiries strongly criticized Captain Lord, finding his conduct highly reprehensible. His failure to act or even to comprehend the magnitude of the situation occurring directly on his horizon remains one of the greatest moral and maritime failures in disaster history. The suspicion persists that Lord was not merely negligent, but perhaps intentionally complicit in a greater scheme, a theory fueled by the sheer proximity of his ship to the sinking site. Beyond the official conclusions, the conspiracy theories surrounding the Titanic's demise deepened into the very fabric of the tragedy. The Olympic switch conspiracy gained traction among those who distrusted the official reports. Proponents argue that the damaged Olympic, disguised as the Titanic, was intentionally scuttled. They point to the meticulous removal of evidence, the heavy insurance payout, and the fact that J.P. Morgan himself, the one who stood to gain most from the elimination of his financial rivals, conveniently missed the voyage. The theory suggests the iceberg collision was either orchestrated or allowed to happen, capitalizing on the ship's vulnerability to guarantee a swift sinking and prevent an extended investigation that might uncover the structural deficiencies of the allegedly switched vessel. The modern discovery of the wreck in 1985 by Robert Ballard confirmed many details of the sinking, but also introduced new elements to the mystery. The wreck was found in two distinct pieces, exactly as predicted by the snapping of the hull. This finding definitively refuted early theories that the ship sank whole. However, the discovery also revealed that the hull damage was not a massive gaping hole, but a series of small, stress-induced tears along the rivet lines. Metallurgical analysis later suggested the steel used in the hull plates was highly susceptible to brittle fracture in the extreme cold of the North Atlantic, a design flaw that turned a minor scrape into a catastrophic hull failure. The enduring legacy of the Titanic is not just a tale of technological hubris, but a narrative of sacrifice and class injustice. The disaster resulted in profound, necessary changes in maritime law, including mandatory 24-hour radio watches on ships, new lifeboat regulations ensuring enough seats for every soul on board, and the establishment of the International Ice Patrol. Yet the question of intent lingers. Did the fate of the Titanic and the wealthy financial opponents aboard serve a calculated purpose, paving the way for the formation of the Federal Reserve? Or was it the culmination of human error, corporate greed, and a simple twist of fate amplified by the silent, unforgivable indifference of a passing ship? The story of the Titanic remains an open file in history, a massive, silent grave at the bottom of the Atlantic, holding not just the remnants of a great ship, but the chilling secrets of an era defined by ambition, arrogance, and the dark cost of unchecked power.